Hello, everyone. Thanks for tuning in again. I am by my lonesome today, but I wanted to share with you something that I have experienced recently, and also know that a lot of people that I have talked to struggle and have some sort of concern or internal struggle about this topic. So we're talking about internal accountability. And really through the lens of experiencing conflict or some sort of trauma, or being in a situation where you have worked on healing and there are things that you've been working on and there are things that you've experienced in your past, and it just seems like you want to be internally accountable, but there are these external factors that are happening as well, and you can't really balance how to handle that thing. So, you know that I share parts of my story to relate to you on these topics. And so, one of the things that I have shared with you before is that I sometimes struggle with defensiveness. And that struggle can come across in arguments as me trying to say that I'm not doing something wrong, or it can come across as me um, maybe not being apologetic about things. And I think that that is definitely deeper than just not being apologetic, because I do and can apologize for things that I really see that I did something wrong in. The defensiveness comes out when I feel like somebody continues to find something wrong with the numerous amounts of things that I do, or that I really don't feel like I did something wrong. So I want to come to some sort of common ground of why the person might feel that what I did was wrong, and also understanding what I could do better in the future. But I think that when you're thinking about internal accountability, there are two, and I'm going to share the actual hacks with you first before I share the three basic parts. But there are two things that I tend to do to make sure that I'm not being defensive and that I'm not having a struggle with taking blame for something. And I don't really like when people blame you for something. I think that, especially if it's a relational thing, it really shouldn't be a blame situation. It should be a, here's my perspective, here's your perspective. Let's value both perspectives. And how can we work on the relationship given that those two perspectives exist? Instead of saying you did something wrong and I didn't do anything wrong. And so because you did something wrong, you should agree with me in order for us to no longer feel like we're in this space. So something that I do, and there are two of them, is I'll ask myself initially, if someone brings a concern to me, I'll say, is this a me problem? Is it a you problem, or is it an us problem? The reason I ask myself that is I have to be able to rationalize with myself if I'm struggling with defensiveness because I'm having a concern right now with something that's going on inside of me. Or is it a you problem? Are you continuously accusing me of things, or continuously finding something wrong with something that I'm doing because there's something going on internally within you that makes you feel like you need to place bigger expectations on me? Or is it an us problem? Is there a dance that we're doing where if you need more of something, you have to cause an argument with me or blame me for doing something wrong so that you can feel like you can get that thing, instead of just voicing that something more needs to happen? Like, let's say it's reassurance. I need more reassurance. What does that look like? Like, how does it look to get reassurance? And it's a both person concern, right? So like, if you need more reassurance, then I have to feel like I'm at a space where I have the capacity to give you that much reassurance, because sometimes what you might need can feel overwhelming to the other person, especially if it's a consistent thing. So if it's an us problem, is it this dance that we're doing that's kind of a pattern in our relationship? And then the other hack is to ask yourself, what's a story that I'm telling myself? So oftentimes we hear what the person is saying, and then instead of really just taking an assessment of what's actually happening, we'll say, okay, well, they think this and they're doing this and this is this way, etc. We make up this entire narrative in our head that really isn't true. And so I'll say, what's a story that I'm telling myself? So sometimes that story will be, this person finds something wrong with everything, or this person has completely unrealistic realistic expectations for me. And the reason that you ask yourself, what's a story that I'm telling myself, is so that you can connect the dots to see if that story is actually what is happening, or if it's something that you created in your head based on those. Is it a me problem, you problem, or us problem? So the first thing that I think is really important for us to take account of is our core beliefs. So what are the things that you're sensitive about? And that's not sensitive in the way of somebody else telling you that you're too sensitive, because that's manipulation. But it's sensitive in the way of what's something that bothers me, and how is that related to what I've been through? So, for instance, for me, there is a core belief that has existed since I was a kid that says you're not enough. And because that core belief exists, if someone brings something to me and they're consistently saying, you're not doing enough, you're not being enough, you're not saying enough, or whatever the case is, that core belief gets triggered. And so I go back to that and I internalize in my ego and say, no matter what I do, it's not enough. Look how much I'm doing, and that's not enough. And so we really have to assess our core beliefs if we're trying to be internally accountable. And this is for whatever your defense mechanism might be. Mine is to get defensive. Yours might be to lash out. Yours might be to yell. Yours might be to, what's the word? Stonewall. There it is. I was like, I know there's an S. Stonewall, or, give the silent treatment, or whatever it is. None of those are actually good ways to respond to the situation. However, we have to know where they're coming from so that we can assess why they're coming up. Because a defense mechanism is just that, a way that your ego is trying to defend itself from some sort of threat. And the threat at that moment is that core belief becoming reality. So if I have that core belief that I'm not enough, and someone is constantly bringing complaints and criticisms, that is going to trigger that core belief, and it's going to in turn trigger that defensiveness. Does that mean that it's the other person's fault? No. However, we'll get to the part about what the other person's responsibility inside of that is, but it really is yours to say, okay, I feel myself being defensive right now. Why is that happening? Let me assess the situation, and how is this related to my core belief? The second one is that you have to know your triggers, right? And so if you've been in an abusive relationship before, yelling is a trigger. So as soon as someone starts yelling, my defense mechanism goes up a million. Why does that happen? Because it's a trigger for me. So if you're yelling, then clearly there's a threat there. And so my defense mechanism says, okay, time to come out now, because this person is doing something that clearly triggers you. Now, obviously, it's important to share those triggers with the people in your life, because if they know that those things are your triggers, then oftentimes if they care about you and love you, they will avoid doing those things. When you're triggered, what's externally happening causes you to have more internal accountability, right? So it's not, I'm mad because this person is yelling. No, you are triggered because that person is yelling, but there's some sort of accountability that you need to take internally. This is triggering me. My defense mechanism is coming out, and it is not okay for me to be yelled at, because that person's defense mechanism is yelling, and they need to internally assess themselves as well for that one. But when you say, okay, well, external things trigger me, then you're giving all of the power to everything that's outside of you to internally create a sense of chaos inside your body. If you know to say, okay, something is triggering me, and because that thing is triggering me, now I need to go internally and see what's happening inside of me that's making me be triggered and making that defense mechanism come up, and how can I be internally accountable for this thing? This is the part where you really have to set boundaries with people, right? So if I feel myself getting defensive, I have to end that conversation. Now, I don't have to do it in an ugly way, but I can say, hey, listen, you're yelling and I can't hear you because my defense mechanism is loud right now and I can't hear the words you're saying. So I really need to be able to end this conversation right now, and we can revisit it again, knowing that you're not going to yell and I'm not going to be defensive, so that we can hear one another. If those two things can't happen, it's literally two defense mechanisms fighting a battle against each other. I'm going to yell louder. Well, I'm going to put up my defense mechanism louder and just tell you about how I'm doing all the things that I feel like I'm doing, and you're just going to keep yelling louder. And these two defense mechanisms are going to just fight and battle it out against one another. No one wins in that situation except for your egos. The relationship does not win. The person who has the yelling defense mechanism not winning, and you certainly are not winning because now you feel wounded. That does not mean that you're victimizing yourself. So let me make that clear. Just because someone becomes defensive or their defense mechanism comes out, it does not mean that they're immediately victimizing themselves. I know this is why I'm doing this podcast, because you have to know internally what you're accountable for, because your accountability is important. If I do not want to be yelled at, and if I don't want to be activated inside of my defense mechanism, then I need to make sure that I'm creating boundaries for what externally is causing those triggers. Then I need to go internally and ask myself questions like, why is this coming up? And all of the questions that I said that you have to ask when you're, what's a story that I'm telling myself? Is this a me problem, them problem, or us problem? And then I think that this one is possibly the most important, and it is know who you're healing with. And I know we've heard know who you're dealing with, but know who you're healing with. So defense mechanisms and those internal systems inside of us are all things that we're working on, processing, and healing every single day. If you're with someone, or you're in relation with someone, or even friendship with someone, and that person cannot understand that you need them to be more cognizant of something because of your internal trigger, then the person you're healing with is actually not helping you heal. So if you've shared with them your sensitivity, which earlier I said that you have to make sure that you let it be known, like, I'm really sensitive to yelling, I'm really sensitive to these type of remarks because it takes me back to this space. If you've been clear about that, and you've been clear about what's going to happen if that starts happening, I'll be defensive and I'm going to end the conversation, right? If you've been very clear about that, then they should grow themselves in a way that helps for you to grow as well. If the person you're dealing with is doing things to exacerbate those core beliefs and those triggers, then they're not somebody that you can heal with, right? And if it doesn't, then if it basically, if what they're doing triggers you, then you can't grow and heal in spaces that are hurting you. And I think that sometimes we forget that. Quite recently, I was in a relationship with someone who had a core belief that someone was going to leave. So they had abandonment concerns. And I have that core belief that I'm not enough, which I'm actively working on. Well, this person hadn't even realized that they had abandonment concerns. So in order to not feel abandoned, they would either say things in the conversation that would cause me to want to exit the conversation, which made them feel like abandonment, or they would do things or say things to create a sense of attachment there to make them feel more reassured that I wasn't going to leave. When you're in a space with somebody who is not avoidant or anxiously attached, and they have a healthy attachment system, then they know, based on the fact that you've chosen them and you're in a relationship with them, that you're not going to leave, right? So this person's inability to trust the relationship really triggered my defense mechanism. So there was a constant dance that we were doing that was, you're doing something, like he was constantly, you're doing something wrong, you're doing something wrong, you're doing something wrong, instead of saying, here's a feeling that I'm having, and it's related to this thing that happened. Can we talk about that and really come to a sort of agreement on how I can feel more reassured and loved inside of this without placing more expectation on you, and how this can be done differently so that you feel comfortable and not like I'm triggering your core belief that you're not enough. And so what happens is, when we're trying to heal those parts of us and we're in spaces with people who are exacerbating those triggers, it becomes a constant cycle of, well, I'm trying not to be defensive, but now you're being accusatory, and now my defenses are coming up, and I don't want to be defensive, so I have to get off the phone. And now if I'm getting off the phone, your abandonment wounds are being triggered. So it's this constant battle, and that's why it is so, so, so important for you to be internally accountable. Because if you're expecting that because you have an abandonment concern, that the other person is supposed to heighten their level of reassurance to the nth degree, but that person also has a feeling that they aren't enough and they're trying to work on it, but you're constantly telling them, hey, you're not doing enough, that's never going to work. There has to be a space where you're internally saying, hey, is this a me problem? Am I expecting this person to fulfill some sort of void that I have right now? Is this a her problem or a them problem? Are they really not prioritizing me inside of the relationship at all? Am I not getting any measure of love or reassurance from them? Or is what I'm getting enough and I'm really needing more and more and more, because once I get my cup filled there, then I just have an expectation of more that should be happening because I've already gotten used to my cup being filled there. And then obviously that situation makes you really look at if it's an us problem, because if that person and you are doing the same dance over and over and over again, then clearly that's an us problem. Can it be fixed? Of course it could. It could absolutely be fixed if both people are being internally accountable. If the person who is constantly critical and accusatory says, you know, a criticism is coming up right now because I feel some of my abandonment coming up. I feel concerned that this thing is happening. And these are my feelings. I'm not blaming you. These are my feelings. And here's how I'm feeling right now. Then the other person can get, instead of being accused and feeling defensive, the other person can get curious. So, what about that made you feel this way? And here's how much I think that I'm doing. Are some of those things that don't resonate with you that I can stop doing because you need more of this? So I say all that to say, if two people inside of relationship or friendship or even family systems are not being internally accountable, or one person is and the other person isn't, then that dance will continue to happen until somebody cuts it off. The other thing is, if you're trying to be internally accountable and the other person is constantly triggering the things that you're trying to change, grow, and be differently in, that's not going to be able to happen there, because people will say, well, it's not my responsibility to be less accusatory so that you're not triggered, right? But you just said it was mine to be more accountable and reassuring because your core wound got triggered. You see how that works? It's not an equitable situation. So today I encourage you to really take account of what are those core beliefs and core wounds that you have, and how do they relate to your defense mechanisms? And then is it something that you've really been trying to heal, or is it something that you need to gain more information on? Because all of us have those, right? All of us have those core beliefs and all of us have defense mechanisms. And then really taking account of what your triggers are. Making sure that you're setting boundaries around those triggers so that other people externally can't cause you internally to act in a space that you're trying to grow from. And then lastly, really taking account of who you're healing with. Because if you're healing with people who constantly trigger you and then play the victim because you've been triggered, because they aren't also being accountable for their internal triggers, then you're going to constantly be in a state of battle. Thank you for tuning in. I appreciate you for listening.